June 21st, 1970. Wall Street stood paralyzed as the news broke. Penn Central, the colossal entity born from the historic merger of the New York Central and Pennsylvania Railroads, had officially filed for bankruptcy. It was the largest corporate collapse in American history at the time. In a single stroke, billions of dollars vanished, pension funds were decimated, and tens of thousands of workers were left staring into an abyss of uncertainty. How could an empire of this magnitude just stop? For over a century, the New York Central Railroad wasn't just a company. It was the undisputed titan of American industry. At its peak, it controlled over 10,000 miles of iron arteries. It owned the magnificent Grand Central Terminal, a monument to capitalist glory, and ran the legendary 20th Century Limited, the most luxurious train in the world. It held the East Coast and the Midwest in the palm of its hand. But fast forward a few decades, and those glittering silver trains were rusting in scrapyards. The stations were crumbling, the tracks were freezing over, and the cash reserves were entirely wiped out. An empire reduced to a mountain of inescapable debt. How does an institution so vast, so powerful, and so deeply embedded in the American economy derail in just a few short decades? The answer isn't just about airplanes or highways. The fall of the New York Central is a harrowing tale of corporate arrogance, the suffocating grip of archaic regulations, and the most toxic, catastrophic merger the business world had ever seen. To understand how a titan falls, one must first look at how it learned to stand. The story of the New York Central Railroad does not begin with steel or steam, but with the sheer, unrelenting willpower of one man, Cornelius Vanderbilt. In the years following the American Civil War, the United States was a nation desperate to stitch itself together. The Industrial Revolution was roaring to life. Factories were producing goods at an unprecedented rate, and the vast, untamed frontiers of the West were opening up. But the infrastructure of the era was a chaotic patchwork. There were hundreds of small regional railroads, each with different track gauges, differing schedules, and fiercely tribal owners. Moving cargo from New York to Chicago was a logistical nightmare, involving multiple transfers, endless delays, and exorbitant costs. Enter the Commodore. Vanderbilt had already built an unfathomable fortune dominating the steamboat industry, earning his naval moniker through a combination of brilliant logistics and ruthless pricing wars. But in his late 60s, an age when most men of his era had long since retired, Vanderbilt looked at the chaotic web of iron rails spreading across the continent and saw the future. He realized that whoever controlled the rails connecting the deep water ports of New York City to the agricultural and industrial hubs of the Midwest would essentially control the circulatory system of the American economy. He didn't just want to participate in this new industry, he intended to conquer it. His strategy was a masterclass in corporate aggression. In the winter of 1867, Vanderbilt orchestrated one of the most brutal and legendary hostile takeovers in business history. At the time, he controlled the Hudson River Railroad, which ran north from New York City to Albany. The rival New York Central Railroad controlled the tracks running west from Albany toward Buffalo. During a bitter winter, Vanderbilt abruptly ordered his trains to stop 2 miles short of the bridge connecting the two lines. He refused to transfer passengers or freight. In the freezing cold, the New York Central's supply chain instantly shattered. Passengers were stranded in the snow, and cargo piled up uselessly. The stock of the New York Central plummeted as panic set in. With the company bleeding cash and investors fleeing, Vanderbilt quietly bought up the devalued shares. Within months, he had absolute control. He merged the two entities, creating a single, unified behemoth. But Vanderbilt's true genius was geographical. While his bitter rival, the Pennsylvania Railroad, spent fortunes blasting tunnels and hauling heavy trains over the steep, treacherous grades of the Appalachian Mountains, Vanderbilt capitalized on the natural topography of the continent. by routing his tracks north along the Hudson River and then west alongside the Erie Canal. He created a virtually flat path from the Atlantic Ocean to the Great Lakes. This became known as the legendary water level route. It was an insurmountable competitive advantage because Vanderbilt's trains didn't have to climb mountains. They could pull longer lines of freight cars using less coal, suffering less mechanical wear, and maintaining significantly faster, more reliable schedules. The route was so smooth that the railroad would later market its passenger service with the famous slogan, "You can sleep." The wealth generated by this geographical and operational dominance was staggering. Money flowed into the Vanderbilt coffers in an endless, torrential stream. By the time Cornelius Vanderbilt died in 1877, he was the wealthiest man in America, leaving behind an estate worth over $100 million, an incomprehensible sum for the era. He also left behind a physical monument to his power, the original Grand Central Depot in Manhattan. Opened in 1871, it was a massive glass and iron cathedral of industry, a declarative statement that the New York Central was not merely a transport company, but the beating heart of the metropolis. However, embedded deep within this spectacular rise was a fatal flaw. The sheer magnitude of their success bred an insular, deeply entrenched corporate arrogance. Under the leadership of Cornelius's son, William H. Vanderbilt, the railroad expanded its monopoly, crushing smaller competitors and squeezing farmers and merchants with exorbitant freight rates. When a reporter once questioned William about whether the railroad had a duty to consider the public interest in its scheduling and pricing, Vanderbilt infamously snapped, "The public be damned." Though William later claimed the quote was taken out of context, it perfectly crystallized the internal culture of the New York Central. They had built an empire so vast, so essential to the daily functioning of the United States, that the men in the boardrooms believed they were untouchable. They were the masters of the universe, dictating terms to politicians, businesses, and citizens alike. As the 19th century bled into the 20th, this arrogance hardened into a core corporate philosophy. The leadership of the New York Central became convinced that their supremacy was a permanent law of nature. They had the best route, the most money, and the tightest grip on the American supply chain. As they entered a new era of unprecedented mechanical marvels and dazzling luxury, the idea that their empire could ever be challenged, let alone destroyed, was considered utterly laughable. But the seeds of their future destruction had already been planted in the very soil of their absolute power. By the roaring 1920s, the New York Central Railroad had transcended the realm of mere transportation. It was no longer just a company that moved coal, grain, and timber. It had evolved into a cultural institution, a sprawling, iron-willed empire that dictated the rhythm of American life. The sheer scale of the operation was staggering. The company commanded over 10,000 miles of track, employing more than 130,000 people. It possessed its own police force, its own hospitals, and a real estate portfolio that rivaled the wealthiest land barons in history. Nowhere was this staggering wealth and ambition more visible than in the heart of Manhattan. In 1913, the original Vanderbilt Depot was demolished to make way for a structure so magnificent it redefined the concept of public space, Grand Central Terminal. It was a Beaux-Arts masterpiece, a cathedral of industry built from granite, marble, and limestone. Its main concourse was so vast that the nave of Notre Dame could fit comfortably inside it. High above the bustling crowds, a celestial ceiling painted with gold leaf mapped the constellations of the zodiac, subtly implying that the New York Central's power was dictated by the heavens themselves. Grand Central was more than a transit hub. It was a self-contained city. The railroad pioneered the concept of air rights, burying the train tracks underground and leasing the space above to developers. This masterstroke created Terminal City, a complex of luxury hotels, elite social clubs, and towering office buildings that pumped millions of dollars in pure profit into the railroad's coffers every single year. Standing beneath the iconic four-faced opal clock in the center of the concourse, one could feel the undeniable pulse of American capitalism. But if Grand Central Terminal was the beating heart of the empire, its soul was undeniably the 20th Century Limited. Introduced in 1902 and reaching its absolute zenith in the 1930s with sleek, Art Deco streamlining designed by the legendary Henry Dreyfuss, the 20th Century Limited was not just a train, it was an exclusive rolling palace. It was marketed as the most famous train in the world, and it lived up to every syllable of the hype. Operating on Vanderbilt's legendary water-level route, it promised to whisk the elite from New York to Chicago in just 16 hours, slicing through the night at speeds exceeding 80 miles per hour without spilling a drop of champagne. The experience was carefully curated to exude supreme exclusivity. Every evening at Grand Central, a custom-made crimson rug was unrolled down the platform to guide passengers to their cars, literally birthing the phrase, "the red carpet treatment." The passenger manifest read like a who's who of global royalty, Hollywood icons, and Wall Street titans. Cary Grant, Coco Chanel, and Theodore Roosevelt were regulars. Aboard the train, passengers were treated to fresh caviar, barber shops, private secretaries, and club cars that mirrored the finest gentlemen's lounges in London. The 20th Century Limited was the physical manifestation of the American dream, a steel arrow shooting through the night, proving that mankind had finally conquered the vast, unforgiving distances of the North American continent. Financially, the New York Central was an unstoppable juggernaut. Its stock was considered a bedrock investment, a widows' and orphans' stock so safe and reliable that generations of Americans built their life savings and pension funds around its guaranteed dividends. During the peak years, the railroad was moving roughly an eighth of all the freight in the United States. Its executives were treated like heads of state. When the president of the New York Central spoke, Washington listened. However, this era of unprecedented glory was dangerously intoxicating. The executives sitting in the mahogany-paneled boardrooms high above Park Avenue began to suffer from a fatal corporate disease, institutional blindness. They were making so much money, and their system was so vast and flawless that they simply stopped looking at the horizon. This illusion of invincibility was only reinforced by the outbreak of World War II. As America mobilized for global conflict, the government leaned heavily on the railroads to transport troops, munitions, and raw materials. The New York Central experienced a massive artificial surge in traffic. Trains ran at maximum capacity, day and night, carrying millions of soldiers and endless tons of steel. The cash reserves swelled to record highs. But this wartime boom was a deceptive final flash of glory. It masked deep, systemic vulnerabilities. The railroad was relying on heavy, labor-intensive infrastructure. Their massive steam locomotives required constant, expensive maintenance. Their unionized workforce was demanding higher wages. And worst of all, their monopoly on long-distance travel had bred a deep complacency in customer service for the average, non-elite passenger. The leadership of the New York Central firmly believed that the golden age of rail would last forever. They were convinced that America would always belong to the trains. They could not conceive of a world where their magnificent steel arteries could be rendered obsolete. But outside the luxurious confines of Grand Central Terminal, the world was quietly changing. Engineers were pouring a new kind of concrete. Scientists were perfecting a new kind of engine. And the ground beneath the seemingly unsinkable empire was about to crack wide open. The euphoria that followed the Allied victory in World War II lingered in the mahogany-paneled boardrooms of the New York Central for only a few fleeting years. Throughout the late 1940s, the trains were still packed. The tracks still thrummed with the kinetic energy of a victorious, booming nation. And the dividends continued to flow predictably to generations of satisfied shareholders. But as the 1950s dawned, a quiet, relentless revolution was beginning to take shape across the American landscape, one that did not run on iron rails. For nearly a century, the New York Central had operated on a simple, irrefutable premise. If you wanted to move massive quantities of goods or people across land, you had no choice but to use a train. The railroad owned its right-of-way, laid its own heavy steel, engineered its own bridges, and paid crushing local property taxes on every single inch of its sprawling empire. It was a staggering financial burden, but one entirely justified by an absolute, unbreakable monopoly on overland transport. Then came June 29, 1956. On that summer day, President Dwight D. Eisenhower signed the Federal Aid Highway Act into law, authorizing the construction of a 41,000-mile network of interstate highways. Pitched to the public as a vital national defense initiative in the Cold War era, it was the largest public works project in American history. To the general public, the interstate system represented the dawn of a new, boundless freedom. It sparked the rise of the American suburb, the motel industry, and the great American road trip. But to the New York Central, it was an existential catastrophe of unimaginable proportions. The federal government was essentially building a pristine, high-speed, coast-to-coast transportation network and handing the keys over to the trucking industry. While the New York Central spent hundreds of millions of dollars annually just to replace rotting wooden ties, repair complex signaling equipment, and plow snow off their private tracks during brutal Midwestern winters, long-haul trucking companies simply drove their fleets onto freshly paved, taxpayer-funded asphalt. Initially, the railroad executives, men who had spent their entire lives commanding thousands of tons of steam and steel, scoffed at the trucks. They derisively called them gypsy truckers and viewed the automobile as a noisy, inefficient novelty that could never replace the sheer hauling power of a freight train. But they grossly underestimated the economic reality of the new era. The legendary advantage of Vanderbilt's water-level route began to evaporate. Trucks offered something trains fundamentally never could: absolute point-to-point delivery. The rigid, fixed geography of the railroad was suddenly a massive liability. A new factory no longer needed to be built alongside a dusty rail spur. A truck could back directly up to a loading dock in rural Ohio, pick up a massive load of automotive parts, and drive it straight to a distribution center in upstate New York without a single transfer, delay, or switching yard nightmare. It was faster, infinitely more flexible, and increasingly cheaper. Furthermore, the labor disparity was devastating. Moving a single freight train required engineers, firemen, brakemen, dispatchers, switch operators, and legions of track maintenance crews. Moving a truck required exactly one man with a steering wheel and a tank of cheap gas. Slowly at first, and then in a torrential flood, the lifeblood of the railroad, freight, began to bleed out onto the highways. The massive steel cars that once carried the industrial output of the nation began to run half-empty. If the gray asphalt of the interstates stole the lucrative freight traffic, the open skies stole the glory. For decades, the 20th Century Limited had been the undisputed king of luxury travel. But the rapid technological leaps made in aviation during World War II were aggressively being adapted for commercial use. By the late 1950s, the droning, uncomfortable propeller planes were giving way to the sleek, roaring power of the jet age. The introduction of the Boeing 707 changed the fundamental calculus of time and space forever. The executives at the New York Central had always sold time. 16 hours between New York and Chicago was considered a miracle of modern engineering in 1930. But by 1960, a wealthy businessman could board a flight at Idlewild Airport in New York, enjoy a dry martini at 30,000 feet, and touch down at O'Hare in Chicago in under 3 hours. The celebrities, the politicians, and the Wall Street elite, the very people who had once treated the crimson red carpet at Grand Central as their personal runway, abandoned the trains with dizzying speed. They traded the velvet-lined dining cars and mahogany smoking lounges for the futuristic, pressurized cabins of commercial jets. The romantic rhythm of the rails simply could not compete with the sheer, brute velocity of the sky. The physical decline of the railroad's legendary passenger service was heartbreaking to watch. As revenue plummeted, the red carpet was quietly retired. The champagne was replaced by lukewarm coffee. The fresh caviar disappeared. The dining cars, once revered as rolling temples of gastronomy, began to lose money so fast they were uncoupled and left to gather dust in the rail yards. But the exodus of luxury passengers was only half the tragedy. The true fatal financial devastation came from an invisible, decidedly unglamorous source: the United States Mail. Since the 19th century, passenger trains across America had been heavily subsidized by lucrative contracts with the post office. The New York Central hauled millions of tons of mail in specialized cars attached to their passenger routes. It was reliable, guaranteed, steady income that kept the otherwise unprofitable passenger lines afloat. But as airplanes and trucks proved they could move the mail faster and cheaper, the federal government began systematically stripping these vital contracts away from the railroads. When the mail contracts vanished, the horrifying financial reality of passenger rail travel was laid bare. Moving a heavy steel train carrying a few dozen people across hundreds of miles was staggeringly expensive. Without the postal subsidies and the high-paying elite travelers, passenger service instantly transformed from the pride of the empire into a gaping financial black hole. Every single time a passenger train left a station, the New York Central bled cash. The once magnificent passenger terminals, built to handle tens of thousands of daily travelers, echoed with emptiness. They became cavernous monuments to a bygone era, too expensive to heat, too expensive to clean, and impossible to tear down. For the first time in its century-long history, the railroad found itself fighting a two-front war against enemies it could not simply buy out, outmuscle, or crush beneath its financial weight. The sky above them was filled with jet contrails, the land beside them was paved with endless concrete, and the invincible giant, stripped of its monopolies, was beginning to suffocate. The true tragedy of the New York Central Railroad was not simply that it faced fierce new competition from the skies and the highways. The profound, agonizing tragedy was that when the fight for survival finally arrived, the railroad was legally prohibited from defending itself. To understand the suffocating reality the company faced in the mid-20th century, one must look back to the ghosts of its own past. During the late 1800s, when William H. Vanderbilt was dismissing the public with his infamous "be damned" remark, the railroads had operated as ruthless, unchecked monopolies. They could bankrupt a rural farmer or elevate an industrialist simply by manipulating freight rates on a whim. In response to this immense concentrated power, the United States government created the Interstate Commerce Commission, or ICC, in 1887. For decades, the ICC's singular mission was to keep the monopolistic railroads on a tight, unforgiving leash. Every price they charged, every schedule they set, and every mile of track they laid or removed required federal approval. By the 1950s, the world had fundamentally transformed. The railroad's absolute monopoly had been permanently shattered by the internal combustion engine, the interstate highway system, and the commercial jetliner. The New York Central was no longer a predator. It was bleeding prey. Yet inside the marble halls of Washington, D.C., time had stood perfectly still. The ICC continued to govern the transportation sector as if it were still 1895. The rules written to restrain the 19th century robber barons were now acting as a legislative straitjacket on a dying 20th century industry. The most catastrophic manifestation of this regulatory paralysis was the pricing system. In a normal free market economy, a company facing cheaper competition will immediately lower its own prices to retain its customers. For the New York Central, this basic instinct of survival was illegal. If the railroad executives wanted to lower the freight rate on a shipment of coal to undercut a new trucking company, they could not simply change the price. They had to file a formal request with the ICC. This initiated a labyrinthine bureaucratic process that involved public hearings, thousands of pages of legal briefs, and months, sometimes years, of agonizing delays. Furthermore, the ICC operated under an unwritten policy of umbrella pricing, meaning they often explicitly forbade the railroad from lowering its rates because doing so would be unfair to the competing trucking companies. The trucking industry, meanwhile, faced almost none of these restrictions. Agricultural truckers were largely exempt from ICC rate regulations. They could simply look at the New York Central's publicly posted, federally mandated freight rates, walk into a factory manager's office, and offer to move the goods for 20 cents less per ton. The railroad executives were forced to watch, completely immobilized by federal law, as nimble, unregulated competitors systematically strip-mined their most lucrative freight contracts. If the pricing regulations were a straitjacket, the route regulations were an open, bleeding wound. As passenger numbers plummeted due to automobiles and airplanes, the New York Central was left operating hundreds of local, short-distance commuter and branch lines that were losing catastrophic sums of money. The logical business decision was simple: shut them down. But a railroad could not abandon a route without the permission of both the federal ICC and the local state utility commissions, and these commissions were deeply political. To a small-town mayor or a state senator, a functioning train station was a symbol of civic pride and economic relevance, regardless of whether anyone actually bought a ticket. When the New York Central pleaded with regulators to discontinue trains that were running entirely empty, local politicians would launch fierce legal battles to keep them operating. The railroad was legally compelled to dispatch full crews, engineers, firemen, and conductors, to drive multi-ton steel machines across the countryside carrying exactly 0 passengers. They became known as ghost trains, haunting the rusting rails of the Midwest and upstate New York, burning through the company's rapidly dwindling cash reserves every single day. Compounding this bureaucratic nightmare was the sheer weight of local taxation. Unlike airlines, which used publicly funded airports, or trucking companies, which drove on publicly funded highways, the New York Central owned its entire infrastructure. They owned the tracks, the bridges, the switching yards, and the stations. Because they owned this vast real estate, they were subject to local property taxes in every single county, city, and rural township their tracks crossed. For generations, local municipalities had treated the railroad as an endless, bottomless piggy bank. The property taxes levied on the New York Central funded local schools, police departments, and public works projects across half the country. The tax assessments were notoriously, almost comically, overvalued. Even as the stations crumbled and the branch lines lost millions, local tax assessors continued to appraise the railroad's property at peak 1920s values. If the company attempted to modernize by building a new, computerized freight yard to save on labor costs, local governments would instantly penalize them by drastically raising their property taxes on the new facility. It was a perfectly engineered mechanism for corporate destruction. The New York Central was trapped in a financial vice. On one side, heavily subsidized, unregulated competitors were stealing their revenue. On the other side, an ossified federal bureaucracy prevented them from fighting back or cutting their losses, while local governments ruthlessly drained whatever capital they had left. The giant was tied down, suffocating under mountains of red tape. The men at the helm realized that continuing on this path meant absolute, mathematical certainty of death. The system could not be fixed. It had to be fundamentally, violently altered. And in their desperation to break free from the stranglehold, the leadership of the New York Central was about to make a series of fatal, irreversible gambles. By the early 1950s, the scent of blood was in the water, and Wall Street knew it. The New York Central was vast, prestigious, and dying. Its massive assets were severely undervalued. Its management was perceived as aristocratic and sluggish, and its stock price was stagnating. To a certain breed of financier, this was an irresistible target. Enter Robert R. Young. Young was a flamboyant, combative Texas financier who styled himself as a populist crusader against the entrenched old money elites of the East Coast rail establishment. In 1954, he launched one of the most vicious, highly publicized hostile takeover battles in American corporate history. Young bought full-page newspaper ads attacking the Central's board of directors, accusing them of gross incompetence and financial mismanagement. He promised the frustrated shareholders that if they gave him control, he would slash the corporate bloat, modernize the rotting infrastructure, and restore the legendary dividend payouts that had once made the railroad a bedrock of American wealth. Against all odds, the populist raider won. In a stunning corporate upset, Robert R. Young seized control of the New York Central. But winning the boardroom battle was the easy part. Saving the empire was a monumental task. Young knew he was a financier, not a railroader. To execute his grand vision, he needed a miracle worker. He found one in Alfred E. Perlman. Hired away from the Denver and Rio Grande Western, Perlman was a brilliant, hard-nosed, unsentimental engineer who understood exactly what it took to run a railroad in the modern era. When Perlman arrived in New York to take over as president, he was horrified by what he found. The New York Central was operating like a 19th century fiefdom. It was suffocating under layers of middle management, clinging to obsolete steam locomotives and bleeding cash from every decaying branch line. Perlman went to work with a ruthless, surgical precision. He realized that the railroad's greatest physical asset, its massive four-track main line connecting New York to Chicago, was now a tax liability. Because local governments taxed the railroad on every foot of track, Perlman ordered his crews to rip up 2 of the 4 main tracks. He replaced them with centralized traffic control, CTC, a cutting-edge electronic signaling system that allowed trains to run in both directions on fewer tracks with greater efficiency. He aggressively retired the last of the romantic, coal-hungry steam locomotives, fully dieselizing the fleet to slash fuel and maintenance costs. But his crowning achievements were the new electronic classification yards. In places like Elkhart, Indiana, and Buffalo, New York, Perlman built massive state-of-the-art facilities. These yards utilized early computers, radar speed detectors, and automated pneumatic retarders to sort thousands of freight cars a day with minimal human intervention. What used to take hundreds of switchmen an entire day could now be accomplished by a handful of operators in an air-conditioned tower in a matter of hours. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed as though Perlman's sheer operational genius might actually save the company. He shaved tens of millions of dollars off the operating budget. The trains ran faster, the yards were remarkably efficient, and the New York Central briefly looked like a modern 20th century corporation. But you cannot out-engineer a macroeconomic collapse. Despite Perlman's Herculean efforts, the structural decay of the industry was simply too profound. Every dollar Perlman saved by laying off workers or building automated yards was immediately wiped out by the loss of another lucrative freight contract to the trucking industry, or the agonizing drain of the heavily regulated, money-losing passenger lines. The tipping point arrived with the brutal economic recession of 1957. Industrial production slowed down across the United States, and car loadings on the New York Central plummeted dramatically. The railroad's fragile financial recovery completely shattered. For Robert R. Young, the flamboyant chairman who had staked his entire personal reputation on saving the railroad, the stress became unbearable. He had promised the shareholders a return to glory, but in January 1958, faced with an empty treasury, the board of directors was forced to suspend the company's dividend. the stock price collapsed. Young, suffering from severe clinical depression and feeling a profound sense of personal failure, retreated to his mansion in Palm Beach, Florida. On January 25, 1958, the man who had conquered the New York Central walked into his billiard room and took his own life with a shotgun. The shockwaves of Young's suicide reverberated through the financial world. It was a dark, terrifying omen. If the great raider could not save the Central, perhaps it could not be saved at all. Alfred Perlman was left alone to face the grim, inescapable arithmetic. He knew the railroad could no longer survive as an independent entity. There were simply too many railroads in the Northeast fighting over a rapidly shrinking pool of freight. The only logical mathematical way to survive the crushing ICC regulations, the punitive local taxes, and the highway competition was massive consolidation. They needed to merge with another giant to eliminate duplicate routes, share terminal facilities, and consolidate their dwindling cash reserves. But who could absorb an empire as massive as the New York Central? Out of sheer naked desperation, the unthinkable idea was placed on the table. There was only one other railroad large enough to make a difference. It was a company that shared almost identical overlapping territories, a company suffering from the exact same regulatory strangulation and financial decay. The Pennsylvania Railroad. To anyone who understood the history of American industry, the mere suggestion was blasphemy. The New York Central and the Pennsylvania Railroad were not just competitors. They were ancient, blood-sworn enemies. For over a century, the PRR's Red Team and the Central's Green Team had fought a bitter, deeply personal war for supremacy. Their corporate cultures were radically different. The Central was agile, real estate-focused, and driven by Perlman's aggressive modern engineering. The Pennsylvania Railroad, self-styled as the standard railroad of the world, was deeply conservative, insular, defensively managed, and famously arrogant. Their executives despised each other. Their workers despised each other. Yet, as the 1960s approached, the leadership of both dying titans looked into the abyss. They realized that if they did not join hands, they would both drown in a sea of debt. And so, setting aside a century of venomous hatred, they sat down at the negotiating table. The stage was set for what would become the largest corporate merger in American history, a desperate marriage of convenience that was destined to become the most toxic, catastrophic business disaster the world had ever seen. On February 1st, 1968, the financial world celebrated what was hailed as the ultimate triumph of American corporate engineering. The New York Central and the Pennsylvania Railroad officially merged to form the Penn Central Transportation Company. On paper, it was a colossal titan of industry. It immediately became the sixth largest corporation in the United States, commanding 20,000 miles of track, an army of over 100,000 employees, and an astonishing $4 billion in assets. To the public and to Wall Street investors, it seemed like the perfect solution. The two bleeding giants would consolidate their operations, eliminate wasteful duplicate routes, and form an impenetrable monopoly in the Northeast. But a signature on a legal document cannot erase a century of bad blood. The reality on the ground was a cultural catastrophe. For over 100 years, the men of the New York Central, affectionately known as the Green Team, and the men of the Pennsylvania Railroad, the Red Team, had been raised to despise each other. It was a rivalry as fierce and deeply ingrained as a religious war. The Central was agile, innovative, and driven by Alfred Perlman's aggressive modern engineering. The Pennsylvania Railroad, heavily structured, deeply conservative, and dominated by lawyers and traditionalists, still believed it was the absolute standard by which all other railroads should be measured. When the merger went into effect, these two fiercely proud, stubbornly independent cultures were violently smashed together with almost no transitional planning. The result was not synergy. It was a civil war on steel wheels. Executives from the two legacy companies refused to speak to one another, frequently communicating only through angry, passive-aggressive memos. At the newly consolidated headquarters, vice presidents fought bitter, petty battles over office sizes, desk placements, and which legacy company's logo would go on the stationery. Down in the rail yards, the hostility escalated into outright sabotage. Train crews from the Central would deliberately ignore dispatch orders issued by former Pennsylvania Railroad managers. Green Team switchmen would route Red Team locomotives onto dead-end tracks just to spite them. The labor unions, sensing the chaos and terrified of the massive job cuts that the merger was supposed to bring, dug their heels in. They held rigidly to their legacy contracts. Because the two legacy railroads operated under entirely different rule books, a train traveling from a former PRR territory into a former NYC territory often had to stop and completely change its crew, entirely negating the efficiency the merger was supposed to create. Instead of streamlining operations, the unholy alliance had multiplied the bureaucracy. The giant machine was beginning to tear itself apart from the inside. As the human element fractured, the technological infrastructure of the new Penn Central experienced a complete and spectacular meltdown. Both the New York Central and the Pennsylvania Railroad had invested heavily in early computer systems to track the movement of millions of tons of freight across the country. But in the rush to finalize the merger, no one had bothered to ensure these systems were compatible. They were not. The IBM punch cards used by the Green Team could not be read by the mainframe computers used by the Red Team. The logistical backbone of the railroad instantly snapped. Almost overnight, thousands of loaded freight cars simply vanished into the system. A customer in Ohio would call looking for a shipment of vital automotive parts, and the Penn Central clerks would look at their screens in absolute terror, having no idea if the train was in Chicago, New York, or sitting idle in a switching yard 3 miles away. Perishable goods, meat, fruit, and dairy, rotted in the summer heat because the computers had completely lost track of the refrigerated boxcars. At one point, a fully loaded train of coal was lost for over a week, eventually discovered sitting abandoned on a forgotten rural siding. Shippers were horrified. Infuriated by the disastrous service, even more freight customers abandoned the rails and handed their contracts to the trucking industry. While the physical railroad spiraled into anarchy, the behavior of the Penn Central's executive leadership bordered on criminal negligence. Stuart Saunders, the former head of the Pennsylvania Railroad who had taken over as chairman of the combined company, despised Alfred Perlman. Saunders was a lawyer, a man obsessed with public relations, political lobbying, and stock prices. He completely marginalized Perlman's operational expertise, sidelining the one man who actually knew how to run a modern railroad. Instead of focusing their vast resources on untangling the computer disaster or repairing the rotting tracks, Saunders and the board of directors engaged in a massive, catastrophic campaign of financial engineering. They believed the railroad business was fundamentally doomed, so they began using the Penn Central's remaining credit to rapidly diversify into entirely unrelated industries. They bought luxury real estate developers, executive jet leasing companies, and even a sprawling network of amusement parks. They were draining the precious, rapidly dwindling cash reserves of the railroad to build a conglomerate. But the most unforgivable sin occurred in the dividend ledgers. To keep Wall Street happy and to maintain the grand illusion that the merger was a spectacular financial success, the board of directors continued to authorize massive dividend payments to their shareholders. The Penn Central was losing millions of dollars a day on its rail operations, yet they were paying out cash they did not have. To cover these dividends, the leadership secretly took out massive, high-interest, short-term loans from foreign banks. They were burning the furniture to keep the house warm, desperately hiding the smoke from the public eye. But the facade was incredibly fragile. The Penn Central had become a hollow shell, a mountain of debt teetering on a foundation of lies. And as the bitter, unforgiving winter of 1969 began to descend upon the American Midwest, the hollow empire was about to meet its ultimate test. By the dawn of 1969, the Penn Central was no longer a functioning transportation company. It was a sprawling, chaotic disaster zone that just happened to own 20,000 miles of steel rails. The corporate sabotage, the bitter cultural warfare, and the catastrophic failure of the merged computer systems had finally manifested in the physical world. The operational collapse was absolute, and it was playing out in agonizing slow motion across half the North American continent. The infrastructure, starved of necessary capital investment for years to fund the company's desperate diversification strategy and dividend payouts, was rapidly disintegrating. The heavy steel tracks of the famed water-level route were warping and cracking. Derailments became a terrifying, daily occurrence. Freight trains that were supposed to streak across the Midwest at 60 miles per hour were forced to crawl at 10 miles per hour because the rotting wooden ties could no longer support their weight. For the everyday commuter, riding the Penn Central became an exercise in daily humiliation and rage. Passenger cars were sent into service with shattered windows, broken toilets, and failing electrical systems. In the sweltering heat of summer, the air conditioning routinely died, turning the packed cars into rolling ovens. In the winter, the heating systems failed. Commuters were frequently trapped for hours inside dark, freezing, broken-down trains on the outskirts of New York and Philadelphia. Furious passengers formed militant commuter action groups, actively protesting, refusing to pay fares, and inundating the federal government with thousands of letters demanding intervention. The once pristine brand of the 20th Century Limited had devolved into a national punchline. But the true fatal blow was delivered not by the angry public, but by nature itself. In the winter of 1969 to 1970, the Northeast and the Midwest were slammed by a series of brutal, unrelenting blizzards and sub-zero temperature plunges. For a well-managed railroad, a harsh winter is a severe logistical challenge. For the fractured, leaderless Penn Central, it was an apocalypse. Because the red team and the green team were still actively refusing to cooperate, there was no coordinated snow removal strategy. When the blizzards hit, the massive state-of-the-art electronic classification yards that Alfred Perlman had built, the very yards designed to save the company, froze solid. The pneumatic retarders snapped. The automated switches jammed with ice. As the yards clogged, a terrifying domino effect rippled backward across the network. Incoming trains had nowhere to go. Because of strict federal labor laws regarding maximum consecutive working hours, train crews who had been sitting idle in snowstorms for a dozen hours would simply secure their locomotives, step off the train, and walk away into the snow, leaving miles-long freight trains completely abandoned on the mainline tracks. The entire circulatory system of the American Northeast suffered a massive, synchronized heart attack. Thousands of loaded freight cars sat frozen in place for weeks. Coal could not reach the power plants. Parts could not reach the automotive assembly lines in Detroit. Food spoiled in rail yards from Chicago to New York. In a desperate attempt to untangle the mess, the railroad bled millions of dollars daily on emergency overtime, derailed equipment recovery, and massive damage claims from furious shippers. The winter broke the back of the Penn Central, destroying whatever fragile operational momentum it had left. While the physical railroad was buried in ice, was battlewacing, the financial ledgers in the Philadelphia headquarters were incinerating. The Penn Central was hemorrhaging cash at an incomprehensible rate, losing well over $1 million every single day purely on its rail operations. Yet the monstrous debt obligations of the merged giant were constantly looming. Chairman Stuart Saunders had kept the illusion of solvency alive through a precarious, high-wire act of financial engineering. To fund the day-to-day operations and to pay off the maturing debts, the company was heavily reliant on issuing commercial paper, short-term unsecured corporate IOUs, that were typically bought by institutional investors and rolled over every few weeks. It was essentially paying off a massive maxed-out credit card by opening up a dozen new ones. But this desperate shell game relied entirely on Wall Street's blind faith that the Penn Central, because of its sheer size and historical prestige, was essentially too big to fail. In the spring of 1970, that faith finally evaporated. The horrific winter had exposed the absolute rot at the core of the company. The delayed fourth-quarter earnings reports were released, and the numbers were staggering. The railroad was reporting operating losses in the hundreds of millions. Furthermore, aggressive investigative journalists and financial analysts began to peel back the layers of the company's creative accounting. The truth about the disastrous real estate investments, the executive infighting, and the reckless dividend payments made while the tracks were literally crumbling became public knowledge. The banking syndicate, led by the most powerful financial institutions in New York and Europe, woke up to the horrifying reality. The Penn Central was a hollow shell. Panic set in. When the railroad's short-term commercial paper came due, the investors refused to roll it over. They wanted their cash. The banks slammed their vaults shut, refusing to extend a single dollar of new credit. The oxygen in the boardroom vanished. The cash register was empty. In May 1970, a panicked Stuart Saunders and his executive team went to Washington, D.C., hat in hand. They begged the Nixon administration and the Defense Department for a massive $200 million emergency federal loan guarantee. They argued that the Penn Central was a matter of vital national security. If the trains stopped running, they warned, the entire eastern seaboard would lose power within weeks, and the nation's industrial economy would instantly grind to a halt. Initially, the Nixon administration was sympathetic to the terrifying economic implications and drafted a bailout plan. But the political optics were deeply toxic. The United States Congress balked. Politicians were utterly enraged by the arrogance of the Penn Central executives. How could they ask the American taxpayer for hundreds of millions of dollars after spending years paying out millions in dividends to wealthy shareholders while their trains fell off rotting tracks? Under intense public pressure, the federal government abruptly reversed course. In mid-June, Washington officially announced that it would not guarantee the loans. There would be no federal bailout. The executives returned to Philadelphia in a state of shock. It was Friday, June 19th, 1970. The company's payroll for over 100,000 employees was due in a matter of days, and the bank accounts were overdrawn. The greatest corporate empire the nation had ever known had finally reached the end of the line. There was no more track, no more credit, and no more time. The catastrophic derailment was complete. The only thing left to do was brace for the impact. The weekend of June 20th, 1970, was not marked by the roar of mighty diesel engines or the rhythmic clatter of steel wheels on iron rails. It was defined by a suffocating, terrifying silence inside the executive suites in Philadelphia and New York. The federal government had officially slammed the door on a bailout. The banks had frozen the accounts. With the payroll for over 100,000 employees looming just days away, the executives of the Penn Central Transportation Company were trapped in a mathematical impossibility. There was simply no money left to keep the trains moving. On Sunday, June 21st, 1970, the inevitable finally occurred. In a desperate 11th-hour legal maneuver, the Penn Central officially filed for Section 77 bankruptcy reorganization. The scale of the collapse was entirely unprecedented. At the time of its filing, the Penn Central held an unfathomable $3.2 billion in debt, a figure that, adjusted for inflation, would cripple modern financial institutions today. It was, by a massive margin, the largest corporate bankruptcy in the history of the United States. A company that controlled 20% of the nation's freight, operated 20,000 miles of track, and served as the lifeblood of the entire industrialized Northeast and Midwest, had simply run out of time. When the stock market opened on Monday, June 22nd, the financial world experienced a violent psychological shock. For over a century, the stock of the New York Central and the Pennsylvania Railroad had been considered the absolute bedrock of the American financial system. It was the ultimate blue-chip investment, the sacred equity that banks trusted, that trust funds relied upon, and that widows and orphans held for guaranteed dividend income. But as the opening bell rang, the illusion of permanence shattered. Penn Central stock, which had traded as high as $86 a share just 2 years prior during the euphoria of the merger, went into a devastating freefall, eventually bottoming out at just over $1. Billions of dollars in shareholder equity evaporated into the summer air. But the terror on Wall Street extended far beyond the railroad's own stock, because the Penn Central's executives had aggressively sold millions of dollars in unsecured short-term commercial paper to fund their reckless dividend payouts. The railroad's collapse triggered a massive contagion effect. Major corporations and banks suddenly realized that the commercial paper they held was entirely worthless. The entire American commercial lending market froze in pure panic, forcing the Federal Reserve to intervene aggressively just to prevent a catastrophic, nationwide banking collapse. Yet while the men in tailored suits on Wall Street scrambled to protect their portfolios, the true agonizing devastation of the bankruptcy was falling squarely on the shoulders of the working class. Over 100,000 employees woke up that Monday morning with no idea if their next paycheck would clear. These were not transient workers. They were generational railroaders. In countless families across Ohio, Pennsylvania, New York, and Indiana, grandfathers, fathers, and sons had proudly given their lives, their sweat, and sometimes their blood to the red and green teams. They had worked through the freezing blizzards of the Great Depression and the grueling, endless shifts of World War II. They had blindly trusted that the railroad would take care of them in their twilight years. Instead, they were met with a profound, unforgivable betrayal. As the bankruptcy courts unspooled the financial wreckage, it became horrifically clear that the corporate leadership had been paying out millions in dividends to keep up appearances, while simultaneously allowing the employee pension funds to be disastrously underfunded. Thousands of retired engineers, brakemen, and trackmen suddenly faced a terrifying reality. The secure, comfortable retirements they had earned over 40 years of backbreaking labor were vanishing. Their company had not just failed them, it had fundamentally lied to them. The physical landscape of the American Northeast quickly began to mirror this deep, systemic rot. The bankruptcy severely restricted the company's ability to spend money on anything other than the most desperate and emergency operations. The majestic infrastructure that Cornelius Vanderbilt and his successors had built was left to decompose in broad daylight. Grand Central Terminal, once the shining cathedral of American capitalism, descended into a state of shameful decay. Its grand facade was coated in decades of black soot. The celestial ceiling was obscured by grime and water damage. The vast waiting rooms became havens for the city's disenfranchised, smelling of dampness and neglect. Out in the sprawling, desolate rail yards of the Bronx and the industrial outskirts of Chicago, the ultimate indignity was playing out. The glittering, stainless steel passenger cars of the 20th Century Limited, the very cars that had once carried Hollywood royalty, tycoons, and presidents across the water-level route at 80 miles per hour, were left abandoned on rusting sidings. Stripped of their luxurious mahogany interiors, their windows smashed by vandals, they sat sinking into the weeds. The gleaming silver trains, that had once symbolized the absolute pinnacle of American progress and the unstoppable velocity of the 20th century, were now nothing more than rotting steel corpses. The empire was dead. The legendary heartbeat of the New York Central had been permanently silenced, leaving behind a sprawling, catastrophic wreckage that the United States government and the American taxpayer would now be forced to clean up. When the dust settled on the largest corporate collapse in American history, the United States government found itself staring into an abyss. The Nixon administration, which had staunchly refused to bail out the corrupt and mismanaged Penn Central, suddenly realized the terrifying physical reality of their decision. If the trains of the Northeast Corridor officially stopped running, the power plants would run out of coal within weeks. The automotive factories in Detroit would shut down. The postal system would fracture. Penn Central was too bloated and broken to survive as a business, yet far too essential to the American circulatory system to simply be allowed to die. The federal government, deeply reluctant to intervene in private enterprise, was forced to step into the wreckage. The first desperate measure was to amputate the bleeding limb of passenger service. In May 1971, the government established Amtrak, a federally funded corporation designed to take over the dying inner-city passenger routes from the nation's bankrupt railroads. The once glamorous passenger network of the New York Central was absorbed into the sterile, utilitarian government entity. The crimson carpets, the bespoke caviar, and the legendary identity of the 20th Century Limited were completely erased, replaced by generic, budget-conscious train sets. The golden age of steam and luxury travel was officially relegated to the history books. But the freight crisis was vastly more complicated. For 6 agonizing years after the bankruptcy filing, the Penn Central limped along under the supervision of court-appointed trustees, its infrastructure continuing to rot while lawyers fought over the financial scraps. Finally, in 1976, the federal government took an unprecedented step. It nationalized the shattered remains of the Penn Central, along with 5 other bankrupt Northeastern railroads, and combined them into a massive government-funded entity called the Consolidated Rail Corporation, or Conrail. It was a humiliating testament to decades of corporate and bureaucratic neglect. The American taxpayer was forced to inject billions of dollars into Conrail just to make the tracks safe enough to operate again. Fleets of new locomotives were purchased, millions of rotting wooden ties were replaced, and the disastrous, incompatible computer systems of the red and green teams were finally modernized and integrated. But beneath the fresh blue paint of the new Conrail locomotives, the rusted bones were unmistakably those of the New York Central. The most profound legacy of the empire's collapse, however, did not happen on the rails, but in the marble halls of Congress. The horrific death of the Penn Central forced a stubborn, archaic bureaucracy to finally look in the mirror. Lawmakers could no longer deny that the Interstate Commerce Commission, created to regulate the robber baron monopolies of the 1880s, had effectively strangled the railroads of the 1960s to death. By preventing the railroads from competing with unregulated trucks on price, and by forcing them to operate ghost trains on empty branch lines, the government had engineered the very collapse it was now paying billions to fix. This harsh awakening culminated in the Staggers Rail Act of 1980. The legislation completely deregulated the American railroad industry. For the first time in nearly a century, railroads were allowed to set their own freight rates based on market demand, negotiate private contracts with shippers, and swiftly abandon unprofitable, money-losing branch lines without begging for government permission. The Staggers Act saved the remaining American railroads from extinction, sparking a massive renaissance in rail freight efficiency that continues to this day. But it was a bitter, tragic irony. The leadership of the New York Central had begged and pleaded for exactly these freedoms for 20 years. The cure to their terminal illness was finally legalized exactly 1 decade after they had bled to death. Today, the ghost of Cornelius Vanderbilt's empire still haunts the American landscape. The legendary water-level route, carved out through ruthless aggression and brilliant geographical foresight, remains one of the busiest, most profitable freight corridors in the world. It is now operated by modern corporate rail giants who reap the massive financial benefits of a deregulated economy. But the men who originally built it and the empire that ruled it are gone. The only true surviving monument to their unprecedented power sits in the heart of Manhattan. Grand Central Terminal narrowly escaped the wrecking ball in the 1970s, saved by a fierce preservation campaign led by Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis and passionate New Yorkers. Today it stands brilliantly restored, its celestial ceiling shining above hundreds of thousands of daily commuters. It remains a breathtaking, functioning cathedral of transit. But if you stand beneath the great opal clock in the center of the concourse and listen closely, beneath the roar of the modern city, you can almost hear the faint, echoing whistle of the 20th Century Limited, a haunting reminder of an unsinkable empire that believed it would rule the world forever, only to vanish into the night. 11. The story of the New York Central Railroad is more than just a footnote in the sprawling history of American transportation. It is a terrifying autopsy of corporate hubris. For over a century, the men who ran the railroad believed that their sheer size, their wealth, and their absolute control over the nation's infrastructure made them invincible. They believed that the future would always look exactly like the past. But empires are rarely conquered from the outside alone. They almost always rot from the inside first. The New York Central was ultimately destroyed because its leadership stopped looking at the horizon and started looking only at the balance sheet. They ignored the changing tides of technology. They scoffed at the new world of asphalt and jet fuel. And when the regulatory walls finally began to close in, they chose the illusion of a toxic, unholy merger over the painful reality of structural reform. The spectacular collapse of the Penn Central in 1970 fundamentally rewrote the rules of American capitalism. It proved with devastating clarity that no institution is ever truly too big to fail. It demonstrated that when executives prioritize short-term dividends and boardroom pride over long-term survival and the welfare of their workers, the resulting explosion can cripple an entire nation. Today, the rusted tracks and the silent, forgotten rail yards stand as permanent monuments to the dangers of complacency. They remind us that progress is entirely unforgiving, and that the exact moment a titan believes it no longer has to fight for its survival, it has already begun to die. What do you think was the absolute fatal flaw of the New York Central? Was it the suffocating government regulations, the unstoppable rise of automobiles and airplanes, or the sheer arrogance of the boardroom? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this deep dive into the history of American industry fascinating, please make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. We continuously explore the rise, the rot, and the ruins of the world's greatest corporate empires. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next documentary.